1939 as German tanks rolled into Poland, and a rumbling was heard in the Far East as Japan started flexing her muscles. War was in the air. By 1940, though, the U.S. still hadn't become officially involved, but we did begin to prepare.
All about us rage undeclared wars, military and economic. All about us grow more deadly armaments, military and economic.
September 16th, 1940, President Roosevelt called for a peacetime conscription law and the mobilization of the National Guard for a period of 1 year. So those of us from Montana's 163rd Infantry Regiment reported to our hometown National Guard armories. Only 1 year, we thought. On the day we left for training at Fort Lewis, Washington, Montana's 163rd numbered 1,477 enlisted men, 102 officers, and included in that number several Montana Native Americans from around the state. We were all volunteers called to do our duty, and we did. When we arrived at Camp Murray outside of Fort Lewis, our first duty was to set up tents. This was where we would be living for the next few months while we trained. We also ditched the streets for drainage, but since the ground was so flat, rain created ponds, and that's how we came to nickname the place Swamp Murray. But after much hard work and long hours, we finally managed to turn the old swamp into a comfortable, livable training camp. Little did we know, Swamp Murray was to be the first of many swamps to come. By February of 1941, we were moved to a new cantonment area in North Fort Lewis, and there we finally had some real indoor latrines and solid walls. We continued our training in comfort with new enthusiasm, always keeping in mind that our year would be up soon. By May, we were ready to perform as a division and begin maneuvers, so we were transported by rail and truck convoys to the Hunter-Leggett Military Reservation in California. For the next 2 months, we engaged in the largest and one of the most realistic war games ever conducted on the Pacific coast. Then it was back to Fort Lewis for still more maneuvers. By this time, our period of 1 year had been extended to 18 months, but we'd only just completed 2.5 months of that extension when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. We were now officially in the war, and our 1 year had been extended indefinitely.
December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
We were rushed immediately to defensive positions along the northwest coast of Washington, uncertain if and when the Japanese would actually invade the United States. At last, it looked like we were going to put some of that training to use. But we didn't stay long in the States, and on March 19th, we left San Francisco on the Queen Elizabeth. 19 days later, we docked in Sydney, Australia. Then were transported to Melbourne and finally to Seymour, which was about 60 miles inland from the southern tip of Australia. The Australians were happy to have us, because by now the Japanese were on New Guinea and practically breathing down the Aussies' necks. At Seymour, we set up another tent camp and continued our training. We weren't there for long, though, before being moved back north again to Rockhampton in Queensland.
Left shoulder up, pull.
This time we were training in a semi-tropical climate and better country than the cold and mud of Seymour. At Rockhampton, our training became more realistic, and we readied ourselves for the jungle and the amphibious warfare that was to come. During this time, the Japanese had moved overland from the north coast of New Guinea to within 32 miles of Port Moresby on the southern coast. They were definitely getting closer, but the Australians and elements of the 32nd Division were able to drive them back to their north coast and continue to attack their beachhead, estimated to be about 11,000 strong, until late November, when the situation developed into a stalemate. We were then called into action. We were moved by small ships to Port Moresby, and from there airlifted over the mountains to the airstrip at Dobadura. The next thing we knew, we were marching off into the mud of New Guinea, smothered by the heat, attacked by the mosquitoes, We were about to partake in our first taste of war. The situation that faced us looked grim. The Japanese had developed defensive positions along the trails to the sea wherever there was high ground surrounded by streams and swamp. The Australians had outposts between these positions. We relieved them on January 2nd, 1943. It then became our mission to clear the Sanananda Trail. For the first 7 days, we sent out patrols in all directions to try and locate the boundaries of the Jap positions. When a Japanese sentry was found, we quickly brought him under fire and then checked to make sure he wouldn't get back to report to his unit. Japanese defenses consisted of groups of bunkers arranged about 5 yards apart in circular or oval patterns on both sides of the trail. This was to be our dirtiest campaign of the war. Life during the battle was barely tolerable. Rations were meager, drinking water almost unendurable, and we lived waist-deep in swamp and constricting foxholes. We lived with hordes of mosquitoes, rats, snakes. At night, bats and birds filled the air with weird noises, and during the day, there was no escape from the humidity and constant high temperature. We all came down with malaria or some other jungle-related infection that would require treatment long after the war was over. Our only supply trail cut through the jungle, bypassing the enemy's forward positions. We hired native carriers, whom we guided and protected. And with litters of poles and vines, they would trot in with supplies and gently leave with our wounded, going over dangerous and muddy trails to a forward hospital and supply dump. It took us 20 days to clean out the Japs. We attacked every day until all our forces on the Sanananda Trail had eliminated theirs. By January 22nd, the Sanananda operation was completed. We'd removed the threat of an enemy land attack on Port Moresby. More than 5,000 Japanese soldiers and Marines lost their lives. Some 1,400 were killed by us in our first battle. We'd fought the enemy, fought the jungle, and learned our lessons well. After the campaign, in a letter to us from General Eichelberger, the commanding general of the 8th Army called us an outstanding regiment. We stayed on in New Guinea, defending the beaches against a counterattack for the next 6 months. Then in July of 1943, we moved back to Australia for a well-earned rest and recuperation. It was March 1944, and we once again had a change of scenery. This time we arrived at Finch Haven, New Guinea, where we were organized into a regimental task force and readied for our next mission. On April 16th, we started out to make a landing near Idapi, 300 miles west. We were to seize 2 airstrips that the Japanese had constructed about a mile inland from the beach. The Japanese were not prepared for us. They had massed their troops at Wewak, thinking that would be General MacArthur's next objective. With that kind of thinking, they had reduced their troops at Idapi to a mere 1,000. The pre-landing bombardment drove most of the Japs inland and to the west, leaving the airstrips undefended. The next day, after crossing the Raihu River, we encountered some light resistance. Patrols were then sent inland and came under enemy attack and had to be reinforced, but we did our job and finally secured the area. On May 3rd, the 32nd Division landed to relieve us, and we were left to prepare for our next campaign. We were to capture an airfield on Wakati Island, 2 miles off the New Guinea coast, 450 miles further west from where we were. Although Wakati was only 2 miles long and a mile wide, an elaborate air base with all needed support facilities had been constructed by the enemy. Our first landing was May 17th on the mainland of New Guinea near Arara. The next day, our 1st Battalion with Company F and 4 tanks attached, supported by artillery from the mainland, landed in Wakati. The leading wave of our troops came under enemy fire about 300 yards from the beach. Several boat operators were killed. Some boats went out of control before other drivers could take over. 3 of the 4 company commanders were casualties during the landing. The troops were pinned down on beach by machine gun fire from well-constructed gun positions. The tanks came ashore firing as they came down the boat ramps. We lost 2 in the surf, but the remaining 2 were enough to knock out the machine gun positions, and we were able to move forward. From then on, the 2 tanks worked as a team, blasting bunkers and machine gun nests. By the end of the first day, the enemy was confined to the northeast part of the island, and we were kept under continuous artillery fire all night. On the second day, the enemy was completely wiped out. However, some of the Japs hid concealed in underground bunkers and were bypassed by our troops. That night, they came out back of our lines and attacked the beachhead in our battalion headquarters. Our machine gunners stopped them. The Air Force engineers took over, and our 1st Battalion rejoined the regiment on the mainland. On the 20th, the enemy made a night attack on our regiment and succeeded in breaking through our thinly held beachhead all the way to the beach. We forced them back, took some losses, but their losses in the end were heavier. On May 21st, the 158th Infantry Regimental Combat Team arrived to relieve us on the mainland. It was time to prepare for yet another mission, this time to Bloody Biak. Biak Island was the last great battle for New Guinea. The enemy planned the defense of this island around 3 pockets of resistance. Ibdi Pocket was one of these 3. The rest of the 41st Division, which had landed before us, was attacking the other 2. Ibdi was our mission. In a maze of knife-edge ridges, the Japanese had built a network of mutually supporting pillboxes. This series of knife-edge formations paralleling the coast was separated by depressions and crevices varying in depth from a few feet to as much as 50 feet. Some ridges were connected. It was difficult to negotiate on foot, and tanks were out of the question. We gulped the pocket from all directions for 21 days. We managed to reduce the pocket considerably through our efforts, but still they hung on. Finally, on the 22nd of July, we called for assistance from the Air Force. B-24s dropped 1,000-pound bombs, and we moved in the following day. That marked the end of the Ibdi Pocket. After all that action, we moved to leveler ground a few miles inland and constructed a camp area to provide for rest, some creature comforts, and more training. After our rest, we started island hopping in the Philippines. On March 10th, we followed the 162nd ashore at San Mateo on Mindanao Island in the southern Philippines. We turned east to take the San Roger Strip and Zamboanga, which was the 3rd largest city in the Philippines. Zamboanga fell on the 11th. Then we turned north to drive the enemy from the Pasananda area back into the jungle. We seized the town of Pasananda on the 15th and continued pushing the enemy to the northeast. Late in March, we were relieved by the 186th, and that freed us for additional landings. On April 2nd, our 2nd Battalion landed at Tawi-Tawi, and separate units made landings on Sanga-Sanga and the Bangao Islands nearby. On April 8th, the 163rd minus the 2nd Battalion landed on the north coast of Yolo Island. The 1st Battalion moved toward Yolo City, and the 3rd Battalion attacked Mount Bangkao. The 1st Battalion passed through Yolo City and proceeded to attack a series of hills, and all went well until they reached Mount Daho, where 400 Japanese troops decided to make a stand. It took a week and a lot of artillery and Marine Corps air support to eliminate the resistance on Daho. The final battle for Yolo was fought 6 miles west of Daho at Mount Tumatangas. Our 1st Battalion fought for 37 days to secure Tumatangas, which ended the Japanese occupation of Yolo Island. Then our 3rd Battalion was moved from Yolo to Davao and attached to the 186th Regiment to assist in the final mop-up of Mindanao. On July 9th, our regiment was assembled with the rest of the 41st Division near Zamboanga. We were preparing for our next battle, the invasion of Japan. But before we could do any fighting, Uncle Sam dropped the atomic bombs, and the Japanese surrendered on September 2nd, 1945. The war was over. We quickly switched from combat training to training for occupation. We made a peaceful landing just miles from devastated Hiroshima. Our first duty, the destruction of war materials and releasing the Japanese Army food and clothing to the civilians. Finally, on December 31st, 1945, the 163rd, along with the rest of the 41st Division, was deactivated. It was time for us to go home, back to the USA, back to our civilian way of life. Although we were an all-Montana unit when we were inducted in 1940, by the time we were deactivated, we had become assimilated with replacements from every state in the Union. Regardless of where they came from, they all contributed to the success of our outstanding regiment. Our motto was, "Men do your duty," and we did.